Hey everyone, tonight we are going to dive into the heart of a pre-dawn storm at a deserted Outback station, tracing every shiver, every gust, and every heartbeat as we confront isolation and uncertainty in the wild. We'll walk through deserted corridors, feel the lanterns flicker against gathering darkness, and face an unforgiving wind that tests every ounce of resolve. So before we get started, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so I can keep making better videos. Now enjoy a cup of hot tea and let's embark on this journey together tonight. I pulled up to the old Outback station just as twilight spilled across the horizon like hot ink. The sky, once a bright wash of fading gold, deepened into bruised purples and charcoal grays as if nature itself was bracing for what was to come. My U-Dump rusted truck rattled to a stop in the cracked dirt courtyard. Its engine's final sputter faded into the stillness, leaving me with nothing but the whisper of desert insects and the faint whistle of wind across the plains. I paused, and resting on the door handle, breathing in the dry, metallic scent of impending dusk. My nerves hummed with tension, equal parts excitement and dread, because I'd planned to shelter in this forsaken outpost, but never in my wildest imaginings had I signed on to survive a storm like this. The station stood silent, its corrugated iron walls bathed in the last glow of day, paint peeled in long ribbons, and every window was a dark, unbroken stare. The only sign of love was the wood-framed sign over the front door, its letters half erased, Cookville Rail Station. I'd found this place on an old survey map, marked as disused for decades, and thought it perfect for solitude, for testing my gear, my grit. But standing there as the desert swallowed the horizon, I felt an urgent tremor of regret. Out here, help was hours away, and the land paid no heed to pleas for mercy. I hoisted my weather-worn pack from the passenger seat, its leather buckles scuffed from years of travel. Inside a folded oilskin tarp, a battered lantern, extra fuel canisters, dehydrated rations, and a first aid kit I'd already shaken open twice today. My fingers brushed the roll of soft bread. Inside the kit, a silent promise that I was as prepared as I could be. Yet the wind whispered across the plains, reminding me that preparation could only go so far. I closed my eyes, feeling dusk's cooling breath against my temples. My pulse thudded loud enough I could taste it in my teeth. I took my first step toward the station door, my boots stirring tiny puffs of ochre dust. Every instinct told me to hurry inside, to find shelter before darkness fully claimed the land. But instinct also said to observe, to respect the wild. I lingered at the threshold, listening the distant call of a lone crow, the rustle of dry spinifex, and the steady sigh of wind flirting with the broken roof panels. That sigh felt like a dark promise, whispering of a storm brewing far off, and of challenges no checklist or ration pack could solve. Reaching for the latch, I felt the chill that comes when daylight retreats, as though the station itself exhaled a breath of cold anticipation. Metal screeched as the door swung inward, revealing a narrow entry hall strewn with debris, shards of broken glass, tattered flyers flapping in a gust that sneaked past the cracked frame. The lantern dangling by its hook overhead cast a weak cone of light that trembled with every minor shift of atmosphere. My heart hammered. Every step deeper swallowed the glow until the station felt less like a refuge and more like the maw of some ancient beast waiting to swallow wayfarers whole. I paused at the threshold of a larger room, the former waiting lounge, its boarded windows letting in slivers of oncoming night. Wooden benches sat abandoned, their surfaces scarred by decades of neglect. A battered clock on the far wall, its face cracked, looked frozen at 6:47. I told myself it was just a mirror of my heartbeat, stuck suspended in a moment of tension. The air inside smelled of dust, old sweat, and slightly sour metal. I exhaled slowly, letting calm wash in. No panic yet, not until the station truly closed around me. I lit the lantern with steady fingers, watching the yellow flame catch and sputter, then settle into a steady glow. Warm light spilled across the floorboards, dancing against shadows that stretched like long claws. My eyes darted across the room, an empty counter where tickets used to be sold, a faded oil painting of the station's heyday, and a stack of rusting oil drums in the corner, likely left behind by mechanics or scavengers. Every detail felt amplified in the gathering gloom. Every scent and sound turned urgent. I moved forward, boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. Each creak underfoot reminded me that this place had borne weight of travelers, of supplies of hopes and farewells. Now it bore my weight, and soon would bear the weight of a storm that threatened to rip its bones apart. I unshouldered my pack, letting it fall with a thud that sent a shower of dust motes dancing in the lantern's glow. My pack was my lifeline. Within it lay my plan, my hope. But standing here at the station's heart, I knew plans were fragile as glass. I knelt by the oil drums, wrenching off one lid to inspect the contents. The drums were empty scrap metal, nothing more. Storm-proof shelter wouldn't come from scavenging here. I'd have to use what I carried. I closed the drum with a clang and rose the lantern's beam bobbing as adrenaline coursed. Outside, the horizon glowed with a violent undertone, no longer the serene dusk of hours past, but a restless stage for clouds gathering speed and weight. I made my way back to the door, mapping a mental plan, assess the structural integrity, reinforce where I could, and prepare a secondary shelter. My mind flicked to safer days when camping meant laughter around a fire, not huddling in a skeleton of wood and tin. I'd taken comfort in recall, but tonight memory had little currency. Survival demanded presence, attention to every sound, every creak, and as the last whisper of sunset died altogether, I stepped back into the courtyard lantern, aloft, ready to meet the darkness head-on. I crossed the threshold of the station's front door and felt the world shift. The wind's distant howl was muffled, instantly replaced by a hollow hush that swallowed even the faint tick of my own heartbeat. My lantern's glow trembled against peeling wallpaper and across dusty floorboards, revealing the station's silent embrace. This place felt suspended in time, like an echo of long past journeys, and now it held me in its empty arms. With each careful step, the lantern swung slightly, catching broken benches and half-collapsed crates stacked against the walls. I paused, leaning close to the device, watching the flame flicker and stabilize. Its warmth was small but fierce, a beacon in this abandoned shell. I searched for a spot to lay out my gear somewhere, sheltered from drafts and the creeping cold. My boots made soft scuffs on the floor as I moved deeper into the station's bowels. A narrow hallway beckoned its far end, lost in shadows that pooled like ink. Doors lined each side, some hanging ajar, others jammed by warped frames. I chose the second door on the left. Inside was a former storage room rusting tin lockers, a collapsed wooden shelf, and a thin layer of dust coating every surface. The air was stale, tinged with the faint trace of oil and the sour tang of neglect. Perfect, I thought. The less this place had been disturbed, the fewer surprises it could hold. I set my pack against the back wall and knelt to unlatch it, each click sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Unrolling the tarp, I laid it flat and placed the lantern in its center, careful to clear the area of debris first. The pale green canvas felt cold under my palms, but once it was unfurled, it offered a small barrier between me and the grimy floorboards. I slid my boots off and stretched my toes, appreciating the simple comfort of clean socks. The motion pulled at my muscles, reminding me how tightly I'd been gripping the wheel only moments ago. Above me, a single bare bulb hung tangled in wires long since dead. I considered replacing it with a battery pack from my supplies, just to add another layer of light, but decided against it. Battery-powered gadgets could fail, but the lantern's flame was reliable if I kept fuel on hand. I dug into my pack for the small fuel canister, unscrewed the cap, and refueled the lantern's reservoir. The amber liquid seeped in, and I watched carefully as it settled. Then I patted the tiny metal container back into its sleeve. Planning mattered less here than simple maintenance keeping flame alive, pack ready, eyes open. I settled onto the tarp, leaning against the cold wall, and took a deep breath. The station's embrace felt comforting and unsettling at once, like it welcomed me as a fellow traveler, yet warned I did not belong. I rubbed my arms, warding off a chill that wasn't just from the drop in temperature. My breath puffed out in small clouds, visible in the lantern's glow. I murmured to myself, telling my mind to stay focused, to resist the urge to panic. Better to think clearly than to let dread take root. Beyond the thin walls of this storage room, the station lay quiet. I listened for any sign I might not be alone. A rat scuttling through rafters, the creak of shifting boards, a whisper of wind finding a way inside. But nothing came, just oppressive stillness. I realized moisture had begun collecting on the inside of a boarded-up window, tiny droplets shimmering like distant stars when the lantern's light caught them. The condensation was a quiet promise of wind that would find every crack. I reached into my pack again this time, withdrawing a small thermos filled with lukewarm tea. I took a slow sip, letting the slight bitterness settle in my stomach and the heat spread through my chest. The warmth was comforting. I closed my eyes briefly, picturing a campfire and the absence of fear. But here in the station's interior, that vision felt distant. I forced myself to bring my focus back to the present, checking gear, reinforcing shelter, preparing for the storm I knew would arrive. The walls here were made of thick timber beams, rough-hewn and scarred. I ran my fingers over the surface, tracing the grain and imagining the hands that had built this place. The station must have hummed with life, once travelers greeting the guard porters, loading crates, families laughing as they waited for trains. Now any echo of that life existed only in dust and in my own heartbeat. I lit a small candle from my pack and placed it on an old metal bracket beside the lantern, adding a steadier glow to the dim room. Two lights now pushed back shadows, but somewhere beyond these walls, darkness hovered, waiting for its chance. My eyes drifted over a rusted tin box on a shelf, the kind once used for spare bulbs or paperwork. I rifled through it, unsure why, until I found a brittle packet of matches. I cradled them in my palm, realizing how essential such a simple tool could be when every other option faded. I slipped the packet into my jacket pocket and let the lid of the box fall closed, the soft click echoing in the hush. Preparation was a battle against entropy, and every small victory, a lit match, a sealed window, an extra layer of clothing, meant more time against the storm's eventual onslaught. I stood up and paced the small room, taking stock of exits and structural weaknesses. The doorway was the only passage. Boards had been nailed across the lower half, but nails were long gone and wood rotted. A brave gust could splinter it, and if that happened, I'd have to retreat to the center of the station or find another hiding spot. But for now, I pressed my back against the door, feeling its solidity, and measured the distance to each corner. I ran a length of cord from my pack, tying one end to a protruding nail and securing the other to an old bench leg. It wasn't much, but if I needed to brace myself or haul something into place, the cord would help. My ears tuned again to the silent station. No wind rattled these boards yet. No thunder shook the rafters. A fine layer of dust drifted down as I brushed my hand through the air, stirring motes that glowed like embers in the lantern light. I realized that my breathing had slowed, my pulse steadied. In this hollowed space, there was room to think, to plan, to steel myself. I took off my jacket and draped it across my knees, grateful for the extra insulation. Flames danced across walls, and I watched them drawing comfort from the flickering patterns. I felt grounded, anchored by the light and by the makeshift shelter surrounding me. A shiver ran up my spine, and not entirely from cold. I remembered the sign outside Cookville Rail Station and scratched a mental note to research its history someday. But not tonight. Tonight, existence narrowed to this room, this flame, and this heartbeat. I wondered how many before me had sought refuge here, and how many had felt the same mix of awe and dread in the station's embrace. If walls could speak, these walls would warn me of how swiftly comfort could crumble. I took one last sip of tea, set the thermos aside, and checked my watch. Time marched on indifferent to my plight. I folded my hands and sat cross-legged on the tarp, letting my mind drift toward the tasks ahead, reinforcing the broken door, sealing cracks along the floorboards, and mentally rehearsing the steps when the storm finally broke. I would need to move quickly to balance caution with decisiveness. The station's embrace was gentle now, but I understood it to be conditional welcoming until its limits were tested. Drawing a slow breath, I let my shoulders relax. I closed my eyes and listened, really listened, until the silence became a companion rather than a threat. In the station's hollow heart, I found an odd peace. The lantern's glow warmed the small space, and for a moment I let myself believe I might just make it through. Then I opened my eyes, the candlelight flickering against curved shadows, and steeled myself for the night ahead. The lantern's glow danced across the walls like a living thing wavering in rhythm with my breathing. Each inhale made the flame lean toward me. Each exhale caused it to recoil. I could almost feel its pulse, fragile and nervous, just like mine. I had topped up the fuel, replaced the wick, even tightened the burner's collar, but the flame remained stubbornly erratic. Shadows rippled across the room, stretching into grotesque shapes, twisted limbs of furniture, cracked beams that resembled skeletal arms, and dust motes swirling like restless spirits. With every flicker, doubt crept up my spine, whispering that my refuge might collapse, or that I might fail to withstand the storm. I crouched beside the lantern, my fingers hovering in case the flame sputtered into nothing. I stared at the tiny wick, half covered in sooty residue, then dug into my pack for a small metal scraper I carried for cleaning gear. The scraper's edge was blunt, but it did the job. I carefully peeled away the carbon buildup until the wick glowed unencumbered. I exhaled a slow breath of relief and watched as the lantern stabilized, though just barely. Even improved, each gust of draft, no matter how slight, sent tremors through the glass chimney like nervous shivers. A tight knot formed in my chest. This storm that loomed beyond these walls had a mind of its own. I could hear the first faint gusts slipping through gaps around the door's frame, playing a morbid symphony of rattles and sighs. If the lantern went out now, I'd be blind in a dark cage, vulnerable to every creak and crash the wind might summon. I nudged the candle higher onto its bracket, hoping its steady flame would lend support. 2 sources of light instead of one, I thought better than none, but hope was a fickle ally. I stood and paced the length of the room, boots silent on the tarp. The lantern's glow followed me, illuminating long shadows that jumped ahead like hounds in pursuit. In the flickering light, I spotted a crack in one of the floorboards, not more than an inch wide, but enough to let a chill breeze snake through. I knelt and pressed my palm flat against the wood, feeling the cold draft radiate through the grain. My breath caught. Sealing that crack would take time and materials I didn't have. The station was built for utility, not for survival. Its architect never imagined it hosting someone who would patiently scour the walls for weaknesses while an uninvited storm gathered strength. My fingers curled around the edge of a thin strip of wood protruding from beneath the board. I yanked gently, and the plank lifted a fraction. Beneath, I found a tangle of dry grass and old newspapers, likely primitive insulation from a long-forgotten caretaker. I scooped the grass into my jacket pocket. It would help someday if I needed to stuff a gap or dampen a rattle, but that was tomorrow's problem. And right now, my lantern flickered again, lungs of flame, gasping for breath. I dashed back to its side, bracing my free hand against the tabletop, and gently coaxed the chimney stiffer with reassurance. As it steadied, I realized my mind had wandered toward regrets. Why had I insisted on this challenge? I'd had safer options like a proper camp beneath the desert ridge outcrop. But I wanted the authenticity of a station, the claustrophobic intimacy of walls to protect me. I'd craved a trial of endurance, a story to tell. Now that the trial loomed, my resolve felt shaky. My palms grew slick with sweat, despite the chill. I rubbed them on my pants and looked around, as if the station itself might lend me courage. I found an old framed photograph hanging crooked on the wall, a black and white image of faceless station workers milling in front of a steam engine. The glass was cracked and the frame rusted. I pried it loose and studied the grain of the wood behind. Out here, nothing remained untouched by time. Everything aged, corroded, or collapsed. I replaced the photo and straightened the frame as though that small act of order could stabilize my mind. The lantern flickered hard once more, then steadied as if appeased. For a moment, I sank onto the floor and leaned back against the wall. The lantern and candle flanked me, twin sentinels that reminded me of fire's ancient power to bring comfort. I closed my eyes and let the slight warmth seep into my bones. My heartbeat settled. I recited a simple mantra, light endures, over and over, until the crackle of the lantern merged with my own rhythm. The station's walls creaked a low groan that resonated through the rafters. My eyes shot open. The lantern flared brightly, then dwindled. I jumped to my feet, hands gripping the sides of the table. The groan came again louder, as if the building itself was protesting the wind's assault. I realized I'd been treating the station like inanimate shelter, but it was a living thing in its own way, tired and battered, ready to give in. Panic flared, but I crushed it down. Now was not the moment for fear. Now was the moment for action. I scanned the room for anything useful, a coil of rope, a metal hook fallen from above bits of cloth, catching dust in corners. I found a length of thin rope entwined around an old timber brace, likely used to secure cargo once. I tugged it free and tested its strength. It held. I knelt and looped one end around the lantern handle, tying a simple bowline knot to anchor it. If the flame sputtered, the rope could suspend the lantern from the beam overhead, keeping it from tipping. Not perfect, but better than watching it teeter on the tabletop. Next, I laid the rope across the room, looking for another anchor point. My eye caught an iron ring bolted into the wall beside the boarded window. I fastened the other end of the rope there, creating a makeshift swing line for the lantern. I lifted it gently, guiding the vessel of flame until it hung halfway between floor and ceiling. Shadows contracted, and the flicker smoothed as if the suspended lantern had found an equilibrium. I exhaled. The hush returned, but now it carried a different charge, one of anticipation rather than dread. I stepped back and nodded to the lantern, expressing gratitude in my own way. Then I retrieved a handful of crumpled newspapers from my pack emergency tinder and used them to pack around the broken window's edge, stuffing insulated grass I'd collected earlier against the gaps. I worked methodically, my fingers nimble despite the cold. When the last scrap of grass was in place, I inspected my handiwork by the lantern's glow. The seal wasn't airtight, but it would blunt the wind's bite. I sank back onto the tarp, tired, but buoyed by accomplishment. The jittery flicker was gone. The lantern now burned with a steady hum. I glanced at my watch. The storm should arrive any minute now. I wriggled my toes inside my socks and felt a callus there where a boot had rubbed earlier. A pain reminder that I was alive, that each moment of discomfort and doubt was evidence of the struggle I'd chosen. The candle on its bracket still burned its flame, small and resolute. I tapped the base, and it fluttered, then steadied. Two lights glowed in concert, casting overlapping circles of warmth across battered walls. Even here, amid decay, light had prevailed. Light was my ally and my measure of safety. As long as it burned, I would cling to hope. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting exhaustion wash over me. Doubts remained, of course. Any human heart would harbor them before a storm. But now doubt had a purpose. It reminded me to stay vigilant, to question complacency, to push me toward action. I welcomed that tension as fuel, not poison. A gust rattled the window board, rattling the rope that held the lantern in gentle sway. I opened my eyes and watched the flame stabilize itself, bending but not breaking. In that moment, I felt a surge of kinship with the lantern itself, flickering, tested yet enduring. I leaned forward and spoke to it. "Thank you." The wind paused as if overhearing me. Darkness huddled at the edges, but could not cross the firelight. I wrapped my arms around my knees, feeling their warmth seep through my layers. Doubt lingered, but it no longer held me hostage. In the quiet after action, I recognized my own resilience. I lay back against the cold wall lantern and candle casting me in twilight's glow. The station had embraced me, yes, but I had embraced it in return. And together we would face whatever the pre-dawn storm would bring. The corridor beyond the storage room stretched into darkness, its floorboards groaning under unseen weight. Lantern and candlelight spilled through the open door, painting the hallway in wavering pools of gold. I stepped forward, boots silent against the tarp's edge, and into the station's empty halls. Every movement stirred echoes that reverberated against the warped walls, each footfall a question mark in the hush. The air felt thick, as though the building itself exhaled in slowness, its breath stirring motes of dust that danced in the lantern's glow. My lantern cast long fingers of light down the corridor, touching every crack in the plaster and tracing the fraying pattern of old wallpaper. The walls were lined with doorways, some doors missing entirely, revealing small rooms choked with debris, others barely hanging on their rusted hinges. The roof overhead dripped with condensate, where the tin had split each drop, catching firelight before splashing onto the floor in soft plinks. I paused where the ceiling sagged dangerously low, checking that my shoulder pack wouldn't snag. Beyond me, the way back, was a thin line of glow, but ahead darkness beckoned. A sudden creak startled me. I froze, heart thundering in my ears. The sound came from behind a partially closed door to my left. I raised the lantern higher, its flame quivering in anticipation. The door's silhouette shifted as a breeze, weak but insistent, slipped through the crack, nudging it inwards with a soft squeal. My breath caught. I stepped toward it, lantern held aloft and pushed gently. The door swung open to reveal a small office space, a dusty desk with one drawer half open, its contents long since ransacked, a broken swivel chair lying on its side, and a filing cabinet corroded into a rusted shell. I scanned the desk's surface. Among the scattered rubble lay a single ledger book, its leather cover stiff with age. I knelt and brushed away dust, opening the cover to find yellowed pages filled with cramped handwriting dates, departures, arrivals. The last entry was scrawled on a page, dated 1927 final freight to Nullarbor Sands. Station closing. My fingers traced the faded ink, and I felt a cold pulse of connection. Almost a century had passed since someone last recorded life. Here and now I stood in the same spot, adding no scribble, only my footsteps and breaths. A low moan drifted through the hall, sending a shiver along my spine. I closed the ledger and set it gently back on the desk, wiping my hands on my pants. The moan rose again, more animal than wind, and I spun toward its source. The corridor stretched in both directions. One path led back to safety, the other led deeper into an unknown maw. Instinct warred with curiosity. I inhaled, trying to steady my mind, then walked toward the sound. As I moved, the walls seemed to pulse. With each breath, the lantern's light picking out gouges and stains that I'd missed before. A series of small alcoves ran down one side of the hall, each once housing a wooden bench or luggage rack. Now they were empty, but for the station's ghosts. The moan resolved into a low, rhythmic creaking, like a giant hinge swinging under weight. I realized it was the roof flexing under the distant thunder's pressure. The sound repeated a mournful lament that harmonized with the steady drip-drip of water onto warped boards. I paused halfway down the corridor, leaning the lantern against the wall to free my hands. I closed my eyes and listened to the creaking ceiling, the occasional drop of water, the exhalations of wind racing through holes in the tin, and beneath it all, the muted roar of an advancing storm. Far off, a rumble rolled like distant gunfire. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the storm's heartbeat synchronize with my own. I opened my eyes and picked up the lantern, following the corridor's curve to the station's main wing. There, the plaster had fallen away, revealing sun-bleached beams that arched overhead like skeletal ribs. Here and there, bird nests now abandoned clung to rafters built from twigs and remnants of paper. I tried to imagine the station in sunnier times, families waiting for locomotives, porters hauling luggage, children chasing each other in the warm light. Instead, I found only silence, thick and unyielding. I passed a series of French doors that once led to the platform. Their glass panes were shattered shards glittering on the platform beyond. I set the lantern on a hitching post outside its glow, a beacon in the pre-storm gloom. I crouched and inspected the track-rusted rails stretching into the horizon, half buried in red sand. A gust swept across the platform, stirring the lantern's flame and mingling its smoke with the scent of dust and metal. I flinched as the lantern sputtered, then steadied it with a firm grip. Stepping back inside, I noticed fresh footprints in the dust near the door mine, likely from my earlier scouting, but also a faint set of smaller prints that stopped abruptly near the threshold. My pulse spiked. I looked around. No nod of motion anywhere. It could have been an animal, maybe a fox denning nearby. Still, the momentary fear tightened my breathing. I shook my head, telling myself to stay rational. No footfalls but my own. With the corridor's end in sight, I reached a heavy wooden door marked Lamp Room. I'd read about these in station manuals, the place where oil was stored and lamps were cleaned. Inside, I might find supplies, extra wicks, oil jars, even old tools. If any building could aid me in this storm, it was here. I braced my shoulder, swung the lantern low, and pushed the door open. The room was larger than I expected. Rows of metal shelves lined 3 walls, though most were empty, save for a scattering of dust and rusted bits. On a lower shelf, however, sat a cluster of dark glass bottles sealed with wax sun-bleached oil containers. My heart lifted. I approached cautiously, checking the labels. Kerosene 19XX batch. The dates were faint, but oil was oil. I gathered as many bottles as I could carry, cautioning the lantern's flame to stay erect. A coil of old rope lay on a nearby hook, frayed but serviceable. I draped it around my shoulder, the weight of potential safety, a welcome burden. Turning to the workbench at the room's center, I found a leather-bound folder labeled Spare Wicks. I opened it and discovered small packets of woven cotton preserved in waxed paper. A sigh of gratitude escaped me. I refilled my lantern's wick supply pouch, then carefully deposited excess bottles and rope into my pack. My shoulders sagged beneath the added weight, but I welcomed it. Gear was my shield against doubt. As I reached the threshold to leave, a louder crash echoed from somewhere deeper within the station, like a heavy beam giving way. The lantern's light swung, illuminating a jagged hole in the ceiling where plaster had fallen. I felt the station shudder, and a gust slammed through the corridor, extinguishing my candle in an instant. Darkness swallowed the hall, but the kerosene bottles in my pack reminded me of hope. I shook the rope jar, an old trick to rattle unseen threats, and moved quickly toward the open doorway. Back in the corridor, lantern raised high, I retraced my steps, every echo now a guide. My footsteps sounded firmer, fueled by the supplies I'd gained. The storm's approach was louder, a distant howl, a trembling floor beneath the weight of wind. But I had shaken off some uncertainty. Each candle wick and bottle of oil was a refusal to surrender to darkness. I paused where the corridor curved, feeling the station's empty halls watching me, its long abandoned corridors finally stirred to linger by my presence. I whispered to the dust and shadows, "I see you now," and they replied with silence, broken only by the storm's symphony. I settled into a rhythm, forging ahead through the labyrinthine halls, with lantern held aloft, its steady glow, a solitary bulwark against the encroaching gloom. Every few steps I paused to listen. At first, the storm's warning was nearly imperceptible, a soft, distant rumble that resonated through the station's timbers like a faint heartbeat. But as I moved deeper, that faint murmur grew into a restless growl, echoing down corridors and through empty rooms, heralding the tempest's imminent arrival. I felt its pulse in the floorboards underfoot, a low-frequency vibration that pried at my awareness and reminded me that time was tightening like a noose. In the station's main concourse, half of the roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged gap through which the sky's bruised light filtered. I paused there, breath catching at the sight of cobalt clouds rolling overhead, roiling and churning with blood fury. Each thunderclap was a snarl, a challenge thrown down by nature to test my resolve. I steadied the lantern on the ground and knelt to brush away a layer of dust from a metal support beam. The metal was cool to the touch, but I pressed my palm there, grounding myself. I needed to trust the old bones of this structure. If they held true, I could use them to brace against the coming storm. I rose and moved to the edge of the gap, where shattered roof sheets lay like brittle scales. Beyond, the desert wind carved patterns in the red sand, sweeping up tendrils of dust that spiraled skyward. The station's forlorn tracks stretched westward, disappearing beneath a gauzy curtain of haze. Somewhere out there, not far beyond the plains, Thunderhead Towers gathered, feeding on the sun's residual warmth, even as night reigned here. The landscape felt alive with anticipation, and a cold thrill shot through me. I closed my eyes, inhaling, tasting the charged ozone in the air. My lungs filled with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Returning inside through a low doorway, I carefully avoided a broken support beam that lay angled across the floor. The rumble followed me, reverberating through the station like a drumbeat. Each step felt momentary against the ceaseless march of the advancing storm. I spotted a series of old notice boards on the wall, glassless now, their frames empty except for a single poster fluttering in the draft. Beware winter sands, seek high ground. The edges of the poster curled inward, but its warning felt sudden and urgent. I pressed a finger to the paper's center, feeling its brittle texture crumble. Seek high ground, I repeated under my breath, wondering if there was anywhere higher within this station than the main roof. I stepped into a smaller room adjacent to the concourse, a former telegraph office. The old desk held a disintegrating chair, and beneath it lay tangled wires that once carried messages across the plains. I ran my hand along the desk's edge, fingertips brushing faded ink where telegrams had been filed. One scrap of paper caught my eye, a hastily thrown away docket with a single line scrawled in neat script. Weather turning fast, secure livestock. No date, no signature. Clearly someone had sensed the gathering storm decades ago. I folded the paper into my coat pocket, imagining the farmer who'd scrawled it mere miles from here, warning neighbors of an oncoming gale. His foresight mirrored my own need to act quickly. The thunder's murmur grew louder, punctuated by near constant rat-a-tat of wind against the station's facade. Outside, a sheet of tin creaked and snapped, sounding like a rifle volley. I flinched, nearly dropping my lantern, but caught it before the globe rattled loose. My heart hammered, but I recognized the lesson storms pay no heed to inaction. Preparation was the only currency they accepted. I moved to a side wing where an iron spiral staircase led upward. The top landing ended in a boarded hatch that likely opened onto the roof above the concourse. If I could reach that hatch, I might find a vantage point, or at least a place to rig additional supports. The stairs groaned under my weight, each tread crying out in protest. I gripped the iron railing, its surface slick with condensation, and climbed deliberately, listening as the thunder's distant voice swelled to a low roar. Every rung was a negotiation between steady determination and the temptation to retreat. At the top, I paused under a low beam to catch my breath. The lantern flickered, sending shadows diving across the staircase walls. I knelt, dropped my pack, and rested my forehead against the cool metal of the railing. The storm's voice was louder, here almost deafening in this enclosed space, urging me to hurry. I took a steadying breath, opened my eyes, and bent to untie the rope I'd looped around my waist for balance. With the rope in hand, I stood and turned to face the hatch. The hatch was secured by 2 rusted latches. I pried the first free, with a grunt, the metal groaning like a betrayed tendon. The second latch resisted, but with a firm tug, it gave way, and the hatch swung inward on ancient hinges, which protested with a mournful screech. I peered through the opening, and above me lay the sky alive and dynamic, dark indigo ruptured by streaks of lightning. My pulse jumped at the sight. Lighting seared across the heavens momentarily, illuminating the crib of overhead beams like skeletal ribs. But my concerns were twofold. Lightning alarms aside, I needed to secure this hatch so it wouldn't slam open and let the full force of the storm into the station's heart. I rifled through my pack for cord and tarps. The single oilskin would be precious here. I unfolded it with care, wrapping it around the hatch's frame. I tied the cloth to the rope, knotting it tightly and pressing it against the wood. The tarpaulin crackled faintly, and I pressed my body weight against the hatch, feeling the wind tug at it from above. The gusts forced the tarp against the opening, sealing it partially. It wouldn't hold back the storm's full wrath, but it would blunt its teeth. Lightning flickered, and in the eerie cut of radiance, I saw the station's silhouette against a sky that churned like a storm-tossed sea. I felt small beneath that expanse, but found a strange comfort in my vulnerability. I secured the last knot, then stepped down onto the staircase, landing gingerly testing each step as I descended. The thunderhead's low rumble followed me, a reminder of the world's vast power beyond this fragile shelter. Back in the concourse, I leaned against a battered pillar, gripping my knees to steady a jolt of adrenaline. The rumble was constant now, rolling through the walls like distant artillery. I took several measured breaths, letting the lantern's warmth reclaim my core. I tore a strip of cloth from my shirt cuff. My shirt itself was synthetic, but the ragged strip would work as a makeshift seal for a door crack I'd noticed earlier. I pressed the damper strip into the gap, watching it billow as the wind pressed against it. It filled the space enough to muffle the hiss of wind, and I patted it firmly. My improvised seals marked progress, but the warning rumbles told me time was short. I needed to find the most protected spot in this station before the real fury arrived. Naturally, that meant retracing my steps toward the storage room I'd carved into a refuge. I slung the rope coil over my shoulder and set off, pausing at every turn to tighten knots and press cloth into spaces where light and wind leaked in. Every journey back through the halls reminded me of the station's fragility. Ceiling beams groaned overhead, old plaster cracked further, and floorboards swayed slightly under the storm's anticipation. Dust cascaded from corners, pattering like salt against wood. The hush I'd known before had transformed into a tense expectancy. I understood now that storms existed not only in the sky, but in the very bones of this place, and I was learning to navigate both. When I reached the storage room, I ducked inside and closed the door with a soft thud. The tape and cloth seals felt warm against my skin, proof that each counted improvement had a tangible effect. I knelt by the lantern, its bright bowl of glass unshaken. Beside it, the candle offered its faithful glow. I exhaled, pressing my hands against my cheeks, letting relief sweep over me in shallow waves. The distant rumble was louder now, but in here I was safe enough. For now, I let my forehead rest against the beam above the door, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Almost there." The storm's distant growl answered an inexorable promise that truly tested endurance lay ahead. I sank onto the tarp in my makeshift storage room refuge lantern, and candle casting long, wavering shadows across the rough timber walls. The storm's distant rumble pulsed through the floorboards, a drumbeat that tightened around my chest. To calm myself, I closed my eyes and let my mind drift backward back to nights that felt gentle by comparison, when the wilderness whispered lullabies instead of roars. I remembered the first time I'd camped under a rain-heavy forest canopy, the mist slicking the pines and turning cloaks of green into shimmering curtains. Back then, I'd slept on a simple foam pad beneath my tent, lulled by the patter of raindrops dancing on nylon. In that drip-drip cadence, I'd found a lullaby, rhythmic, predictable, comforting. I'd sipped hot coffee in the morning mist, rising to find dew-pearled spiderwebs strung between branches like nature's jewelry. Everything felt alive yet safe, a balance I had taken for granted. Another memory surfaced high on a mountain plateau, the air sharp with altitude and freedom. I'd pitched camp near a crystalline alpine lake, its water so clear I could see trout darting beneath the surface. At dusk, the sky exploded in pinks and golds, and I'd watched sunlight fade over jagged peaks. That night, no gale threatened me. The only wind was a gentle sigh that rustled grass at my feet. I'd crawled into my sleeping bag beneath a canopy of stars so bright it felt as if the universe had pressed its face to the tent's mesh. I'd drifted off to the breath of nature, unafraid. Even the most ordinary trips came back to me. A spring picnic beside a lazy river, the sun dappling drifting boats. A desert bivouac under a sky punctured by galaxies, the sand warm under my skin from daytime heat. Each memory held a thread of safety, a sense that if danger ever crept close, I could outmaneuver it, flee to higher ground, or call for help. Now, leaning against the cold wall of this station's storage room, those memories felt like half-remembered dreams. I could almost taste the pine-scented air, smell fresh grass, and hear gentle breezes, but here the wind outside had sharpened into an angry blade. I opened my eyes and met the lantern's steady gaze. Nostalgia was a balm, but it offered no shelter. I lifted the thermos and took a careful sip of tea, its warmth spreading through my chest, anchoring me to this present. I exhaled, feeling the knot in my chest loosen just slightly. Reflecting on those safer days reminded me why I'd chosen this challenge, not for recklessness, but for the lesson that every environment carries its own tests. I'd faced moody forests and mountain chills, but the sanctuary of sturdy tents and nearby rescues had tempered my fear. Here I was beyond rescue, Here I relied solely on skill and will. Setting the thermos aside, I traced a circle on the dusty floor with my toe. When memories fade into myths, it becomes easier to forget caution. I needed tangible tasks to tether me again. I stood and moved to the door, pausing to listen for fresh threats. The storm's drumbeat had grown stronger, though still distant. I secured the latch and braced a length of rope across the back of the door frame for extra support. If the door buckled, I wanted to slow its motion, buying time to react. In my belt pouch, I found a crumpled photograph, my friend Jenna and me, at the summit of Mont Silver Peak Arms, raised in victory. That day had been a celebration after a grueling ascent. We'd roasted sausages over a camp stove, toasted with hot chocolate, and laughed until dusk. I studied our grins, our bright jackets, the untroubled sky behind us. I pressed the photo against my heart, letting the memory's warmth blossom beneath my ribs. It reminded me that I was more than a lone wanderer. I carried the trust of friends and the strength gleaned from shared adventures. I tucked the photo back into its pouch and moved to my pack. Retrieving a small multi-tool, I shifted its blade to cut strips of canvas from spare cloth I'd stored. I planned to reinforce the tarp shelter's seams, sewing them over a long loop of cord so I could hitch the entire shelter to the ceiling beams if water or wind forced me to relocate. Each cut and stitch grounded me in purpose, banishing the fog of nostalgia's softness. Threading the needle felt awkward in my numb fingers, but the station's quiet demanded focus. Lantern light was dim enough to create intimate shadows, yet bright enough that I could see each stitch. As I worked, I remembered summers spent with NGOs teaching wilderness survival to at-risk youth. I'd shown them how to splice rope, purge water, and improvise shelters. I'd seen their eyes light up with confidence as they mastered skills that turned fear into competence. Tonight, I taught myself those lessons all over again, stitch by stitch. Halfway through reinforcing the tarp, a sudden gust howled against the station's outer walls. The power of the wind pressed against the door, and I felt the building flex under the assault. My heart pounded. I seized the rope bracing the tarp, tightened the knot, then shifted my weight to press the shelter against the ceiling beam. A series of rattles surged through the rafters as if testing my handiwork. I held my breath. The shelter stayed in place. Relief washed through me, warm and reassuring. I dropped the multi-tool onto the tarp and stood, letting the vantage of upright posture shake out tension in my limbs. I closed my eyes and exhaled, letting nostalgia's gentle mirror remind me why I sought comfort in the wilderness, why I craved the primal clarity that only isolation can bring. It wasn't escape, but confrontation with elements, with limits, and with the self. Opening my eyes, I noticed the station's interior anew. Dust-covered shelves, peeling paint, faded signs decay everywhere, yet resilience in every beam still holding. I approached a wall where 2 ceiling boards had buckled, allowing a thin sliver of night to slip through. I climbed onto a low crate, reached as high as I could, and used remaining canvas strips to patch the gap. My muscles bit with strain, but I loved the burn. It reminded me I was alive, capable. When I descended, my lungs filled with air flecked by sawdust. I brushed off my pants and sat cross-legged on the tarp again. I looked at the reinforced shelter above me, its seams bathed in lantern glow. The memories of those gentle adventures still shimmered in my mind. Pines, mountain summits, riverbanks. But here in the battered station, I synthesized that comfort with grit. The lessons of past voyages gave me the courage to endure this storm. I reached for my pack and withdrew a thin journal and pencil. I jotted a brief note: survived memory's storm and fortified shelter. Heart steady. I closed the journal and placed it beside the lantern. In these pages, I archived my journey, ensuring that when I returned home, the storm's trials and the solace of memory would remain inseparable. I scooted back against the wall, wrapping my arms around my knees. Outside, thunder rumbled again, closer this time. But inside, I felt anchored by both past and present, by memories of calmer days, and by the tangible work that whispered of hope against the storm's roar. I closed my eyes, letting the sturdiness of my makeshift sanctuary cradle me. Nostalgia had done its work. It reminded me of safety, of skills earned, and of the resilience born from countless trials. Now I was ready to face the storm's first real blows, carrying every lesson and every memory like tools in my belt. A sudden gust struck like a blade, rattling the boards over the window beside my makeshift shelter and sending a cold shard of air slicing through the room. One moment, the station's interior had felt insulated. The next, the wind's first sharp bite slashed at every seam I'd sealed, probing for weaknesses. I drew a ragged breath as the lantern's flame flickered violently, and I lunged forward to steady it. My knees landed on the rough tarp, jarring against fresh scrapes, but I ignored the pain. The wind demanded vigilance. I rose swiftly, lantern in one hand, and moved to the window. My fingers traced the edges of the cloth plug I'd forced into the gap only minutes earlier. The wind whined through the smallest crack, and each breath it carried felt like ice against my lungs. I pressed my palm against the wooden board, leaning my shoulder into it, countering the gust's force. The wood groaned but held. My heart thudded adrenaline, igniting every nerve. I ripped a length of cord from my pack and looped it around the board's handle. Using a clove hitch, I tied it tightly, then secured the other end to a sturdy beam overhead. The rope drew taut, bracing the board against the wind's push. I stepped back and watched as the gust banged the board, its impact softened by my improvised brace. A spark of satisfaction ignited in my chest, evidence that preparation mattered. But the station offered no mercy for lingering pride. As if to remind me, the wind's cry deepened, resonating through shattered panes and crevices alike. The lantern flickered again, and the candle's steady glow wobbled dangerously close to extinguishing. I shuffled back to where I'd placed the candle and inhaled sharply. There was only one way to protect these flames, by reducing the wind's reach. I grabbed the length of tarp I'd woven into the hatch above and draped it over the window's interior side, creating a second barrier. The layered fabric bulged outwards under pressure but held firm, muffling the rasp of wind. My breath came in ragged bursts. The first real taste of the storm's power left my lungs cold and raw. I sank to the floor beside my shelter, bracing my back against the torn wallpaper, My insulated layers, thermal shirt, fleece shell had repelled the chill so far, but this gust found every loophole. I rubbed my arms, kneading warmth back into stiff muscles. The storm was letting me know it wouldn't be trifled with. I reached for the thermos and took a deep swallow of lukewarm tea. The scalding heat soothed the chill creeping through my bones and steadied my trembling hands. As warmth spread, clarity returned. This was only the storm's opening gambit. The true test lay ahead, sustaining shelter under unrelenting assault. I stood unsteady at first and surveyed my surroundings by lantern light. Dust and debris danced in the beam stirred by every pulse of wind. Splinters of wood lay scattered where the board had flexed. I knelt and gathered the sharp fragments into a pile, imagining a makeshift barrier atop the tarp to catch any further splintering. I dashed over to my pack, retrieved a roll of duct tape, and returned to secure the fragments layer by layer into a crude yet more resilient patch. Each strip wrapped jagged edges until a smooth surface remained. The effort left me winded, but I welcomed the exertion. Physical work calmed my mind, channeling fear into action. I took another swallow of tea, then stood and pressed my ear against the sealed window. The wind roared, but the barrage was less intense, proof that my work had mattered. I exhaled a shaky sigh of relief. My hands fumbled for gloves, and I slipped them on, reprising the role of carpenter, securing final touches on a storm-battered shelter. I circled the room, tightening rope braces, retying knots, and pressing cloth strips into every stubborn crack where air whispered through. No opening escaped my inspection. I drew close and listened for the faintest hiss of wind. It was during one of these sweeps that I noticed a thin line of frost forming on the lower edge of the doorframe. The temperature had plummeted suddenly, a sign the storm carried frigid air behind it. I traced the frost with my gloved fingertip, feeling its crystalline edge. If left unchecked, more frost would form and moisture would seep in as water. That meant wet gear, which meant faster chills. I crossed to my pack, pulled out a spare plastic poncho, and ripped it into strips. I pressed these slick barriers into the frost's path, reinforcing all seals and ensuring water would run off rather than pool. As I worked, thunder cracked overhead and the station trembled. For a moment, everything went dark. The lantern's flame guttered under a violent blast of air, and the candle snapped out. Darkness swallowed me. My heart leaped. Cold air roared around my ankles. I fumbled for matches. My fingers trembled so badly that striking took 2 attempts before a spark caught. I relit the candle, then the lantern with deliberate calm. Light returned dimmer, but defiant. I hugged the lantern close, its warmth, a fragile limb of hope. I exhaled and realized that fear had sharpened into focus. Each boundary I'd sealed, each rope I'd tied, each patch I'd applied was tangible proof of my ability to withstand. I settled back against the wall, drawing my knees to my chest, and let my breathing slow. Outside, I heard the wind's venomous hiss, testing the station's defenses. Inside, 2 small flames endured. I pressed a hand over my heart, feeling its steady beat. This storm's first sharp bite had arrived, but so had my resolve. The station's wounds would gape under the gale, but so long as light endured, I would stand. I'd barely had time to steady my breathing when the station's roof announced its presence in a deep, groaning creak that reverberated through every beam overhead. It sounded as if an enormous hand had settled on the tin sheets, pressing down HUD testing their resolve. I snapped to attention, lantern-raised eyes tracing the ceiling's outlines. The rafters had always looked fragile, but now they shimmered under shifting shadows, each board straining. The storm's howl outside had intensified into a rasping roar that shook the entire structure, and every thunderclap felt like a hammer strike against battered metal. I moved beneath the most precarious stretch of ceiling, where a long wooden crossbeam had started to sag visibly. Its center drooped several inches lower than the ends, drawing a concave arc against the rust-spotted tin. I edged a sturdy crate beneath the beam, knelt on it, and reached up with rope tied to my belt. My fingers worked quickly, looping the rope around the beam and cinching a bowling knot. My shoulders burned as I yanked, lifting the beam a fraction, easing the strain. I anchored the other end of the rope to a metal bracket on the opposite wall, securing it with a double half hitch. The beam creaked, but stayed aloft, suspended from my makeshift support. A shudder ran through the ceiling dust, cascading like rain. I ducked instinctively, lantern held high, so it wouldn't catch the falling grit. When the shaking subsided, I peeked above and saw the rope taut flexing gently with each tremor. My heart pounded at the closeness of imminent collapse, but the beam held. The storm tested my work immediately. A rush of wind whooshed through a nearby gap, sending a spray of condensation down the rope's length. I wiped my brow, tasting grit, and looked around. The station's interior had become a symphony of creaks and sighs, punctuated by distant crashes where heavier rafters gave way under relentless force. I reminded myself that I'd come prepared, that I'd stockpiled gear and lean on past experience. Yet here beneath a tin roof, threatening to buckle at any moment, theory met brutal reality. My limbs trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of defiance. I scanned the room for further vulnerabilities. Across from me, another beam had split its middle, fractured in a jagged seam. I knelt on the crate and crawled forward on my stomach, lantern tucked under one arm. The fracture widened as I watched a dark vein running through the wood. I pressed a hand against the beam, feeling its flex. If that gave way, the hole in the roof would widen dramatically, letting rain and wind barrel into my sanctuary. I reached into my pack for spare wood strips I'd gathered earlier from the storage room and a small collapsible clamp tool. Carefully, I wedged the strips along the fracture, bracing them like splints on a broken bone. Then I clamped them tight, testing the hold. The beam quivered but remained intact. Beneath me, the floor trembled with a low, resonant groan. I pressed my face close to the wood, feeling its vibration against my cheek. The station was alive, angry hissing, refusing to yield. I took a slow breath, willing my pounding heart to settle. The beam's makeshift splint held. I gave it a nod of respect before sliding off the crate and setting the tool aside. Rain began to patter on the roof. First fine mist, then frenzied drumming as the storm hit its peak intensity. Each drop sounded like 1,000 miniature hammers. Water dripped through tiny punctures, creating a rhythm that echoed across the floor. I grabbed a battered tin tray from a nearby shelf and placed it strategically under the worst leaks. It caught a surprising amount of moisture water, pooling and sloshing when I shifted the tray. I tilted it gently toward the door, letting the water trickle out in little rivulets. Small victories, I told myself. Keep fighting. The ceiling's sighs grew louder, as if resentful of my interventions. A larger beam hissed under pressure, and above me, metal sheets buckled audibly. I felt the change in pressure a pop, then a clatter as a small section of tin peeled away and fell beside me. I jumped back, lantern swinging wildly, but the flame held. My stomach twisted at the debris's close proximity. I swallowed hard, then knelt to secure that gap. Pulling aside a corner of torn tin, I hammered using the butt of my wrench a wooden wedge into the space, then tied it firmly with cord. The wedge absorbed the storm's energy bending instead of letting the roof tear further. I patted the cord's satisfaction, warming my chest. Water had begun to pool on the floor near my feet. The tarp offered some protection, but moisture crept under its edges. I grabbed a folded piece of oilskin and fashioned a dam, tucking it under the tarp and into the cracks of the floorboards. The slick fabric formed a barrier, and surges of water redirected toward the tray I'd placed. My boots squelched as I stepped back, but my shelter remained essentially dry. I glanced upward again, heart pounding with every moan. Lightning forked outside, illuminating the station's cavernous interior like a flash photograph. In that stark glare, I saw the true scale of the station's bones, the sweep of rafters and joists worn by age and now battered by tempest. It would never be perfect, but I'd bought myself more time. Time to endure until the storm moved on. A particularly violent gust hit, shaking the walls and rattling the support crates. Dust showered me, and I coughed, waving my hand before my face. My muscles ached from constant tension, arms cramping from rope and clamp work, back stiff from crouching. But pain was a compass I'd learned to trust. It told me I was alive, that I'd engaged fully in this crucible. I rubbed at a scrape on my forearm, cleaned the dust away, and applied a bandage from my first aid kit. The sting grounded me. The rain's pattern shifted again, and I realized roof water would soon come in faster than I could redirect. I needed to prepare for a wet interior gathering gear off the floor, elevating critical supplies. I moved swiftly, stacking my pack and journal atop a cement block I found in the corner, elevating them off the damp tarp. I draped extra rope overhead as a makeshift clothesline, hanging my wet gloves and shirt to dry as best they could. The damp fabric snapped in the wind, but the line held. I nested my thermos flashlight and journal in the highest corner of the room, then returned to the tarp, drawing it partially back. Beneath it lay a secondary blanket, my emergency bivvy. I unrolled it, laying it atop the tarp to create a softer, drier surface. Folding the old canvas strips around it, I created an insulated nest. The rain drummed its strongest on the station's crown, but where I sat, I felt a measure of dry refuge. My lantern's flame steadied its glow stronger against the dim, rain-muted world outside. I sat cross-legged, listening to the roof's anguished medley. The station's structure was protesting, yet holding on much like me. I closed my eyes and let a moment of gratitude blossom for rope, for clamps, for scraps of oilskin small tools that combined into hope. I'd braced beams, patched fractures, and diverted water. I'd carved a niche of safety in a world gone wild. When I opened my eyes, I noticed the ceiling above my bivvy nest had settled into a temporary calm. The storm still roared beyond the station's walls, but for now the roof's clamor had softened. I exhaled, letting tension drain from my limbs. My shelter might creak and moan, but it persisted. The station and I had formed a fragile alliance. I supported its bones, and it sheltered my body. I reached for the thermos again, taking a careful sip of tea. Its warmth spread, and I felt the small reprieve ripple through me. In the eye blink between thunderclaps, I allowed myself to believe I could hold on. Then lightning flashed, the station glowed, and night rumbled on. Darkness swept over the station, like a velvet curtain swallowing every sliver of light. One moment, the lantern and candle had stood as twin beacons. The next, a fierce gust rattled through the boarded windows and shoved the flames to their knees. The candle guttered out first, then the lantern's flame flickered violently before vanishing altogether, leaving me in absolute blackness. My heart pounded so loud, I feared it might burst from my chest. Rain pounded the roof overhead in thunderous waves, each drop a hammer blow that resonated through the timbers. Alone in that void, every breath felt sharp with cold, every heartbeat an alarm. Instinct propelled me forward. I dropped to my hands and knees on the damp tarp, fingers scrabbling until they found the familiar bulge of my matchbox in my jacket pocket. The dark was thick as if drenched in ink, and my palms slid on the slick canvas. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second to steady my breathing, 1, 2, 3, and let muscle memory guide me to the shelf where I'd stashed the box. My fingers knocked it loose, the subtle click serving as a lifeline in the void. I curled the matches in one hand and struck one against its striker plate. The sulphurous spark blossomed into a tiny flame that danced on the head of the matchstick. I shielded it with cupped hands and bent to light the candle first. The wick hissed awake and bloomed into a small glow that banished the blackness around me. I drew a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and then leaned the lit match to the lantern's wick. The flame caught trembling before settling into a steady glow. Two lights returned fragile, yet triumphant, spilling warmth across the room's patched canvas walls and rain-tattered ceiling. I straightened, wiping condensation from my brow, and let relief wash over me in gentle waves. The station's interior looked battered, but intact: rope braces over repaired beams, tarpaulin seals over windows and doors, and a shallow puddle of water gathered in the tray beneath the worst leaks. My pulse still thundered, but in the amber glow, the world felt anchored again. I exhaled, and the lantern's soft flicker seemed to mirror the slow rhythm of my breath. I reached for my headlamp and strapped it across my forehead. The LED beam cut a path through lingering shadows, revealing details I hadn't seen in the dim. Rain dripped from every horizontal surface, wooden crates, rope coils, even my makeshift bivvy nest. I crouched to inspect the ceiling above me, the site of that final brutal gust. The rope braces held firm. The splinted beams flexed slightly, but showed no new fractures. Small rivulets of water trickled along the tarpaulin seams into the waiting tray. My improvised drainage plan was working. Still, the memory of total darkness clung to my nerves like a warning. I reminded myself that storm's blows would come in waves, blackout deluge collapse. I needed to stay one step ahead. I moved through the room, testing every rope knot and tape seal, pressing a gloved fingertip into cracks to sniff out drafts. Each spot where wind tried to whisper through, I sealed anew, duct tape over warped boards, canvas strips wedged into floor gaps, cord tied around stubborn bolts. My momentum banished residual fear. Action was my remedy. My breathing slowed as I settled behind my tarp-lined shelter. I crouched, low legs folded beneath, and placed a hand over my chest. I felt the thud, thud, thud of my heartbeat, steady and insistent. In the pitch black, that pulse had been a tyrant, screaming terror. Now, in the gentle lantern glow, it was a reminder of life's persistence. Every beat was a promise I was here. I was alive. Leaning back against the wooden wall, I opened my journal and flipped to a blank page. My pencil scratched across the damp paper. Blacked out. Found light. Heartbeat is proof. I closed the journal, slid it onto the shelf, and returned to the center of the room. Thunder rumbled so close it rattled the beams. Lightning forked through a window crack, illuminating the floorboards in stark relief. In that flash, I glimpsed the station's battered bones, the gantry's crossbars, the tarpaulin's taut edges, the soaked fabric seals. I let that moment linger, committing every detail to memory. When the flash faded, the room felt expansive, as if the light had thrown open hidden corners. I scanned my gear one last time, ensuring critical items rested off the floor. My multi-tool headlamp, journal, and thermos all perched atop a crate. I'd elevated them before, but water had crept beneath the tarp again during the blackout. Now they sat high and dry beyond the reach of another sudden surge. My blanket bivvy lay folded but ready on the canvas nest. I could crawl into it at a moment's notice. A slow, deliberate breath filled my lungs. I exhaled, watching the flicker in the lantern's globe. In the womb of this battered station, light and life were inextricably bound. Darkness would return, it always did, but I had proven I could answer its challenge. My heartbeat had guided me from panic to purpose. I crouched next to the drainage tray, scooping a fingerful of cold, gritty water that had collected. I let it slip through my gloved fingers. The taste wasn't safe to drink, but it was real, an element of the station's battered remains. I squeezed the drop back into the pool and stood feeling my legs wobble under the evening's trials. I pressed a hand to my thigh, grounding myself in sensation. Lightning flared again, and I welcomed the staccato burst of white light. Rain's drumming softened slightly, as if the storm paused to survey its damage. I found my reflection in the lantern's glass eyes, red-rimmed, but alert cheeks streaked with grime hair plastered to my forehead. In that reflection, I saw not a broken soul, but a survivor refined by trial. I sat on my bivvy nest and pulled my knees close. Lantern and candle stood sentinel at my side. I let my breathing settle into a quiet cadence. In 2 seconds, hold 1 second out. 2 seconds, hold 1 second. Each cycle slowed the echo of fear and stoked the ember of resolve. I welcomed the storm's roar as a lullaby, now a fierce hymn to endurance. I closed my eyes and placed a hand over the journal in my lap. In its pages, I'd recorded trials and triumphs alike. I whispered to the candle flame, "Thank you for staying." The flame responded with a soft quiver. I traced a slow circle around the bivvy's edge, feeling the texture of oilskin canvas and wood beneath my fingers. This space wasn't just shelter. It was a testament to every knot tied, every patch applied, every breath seized in darkness. The thunder's cadence slowed, shifting from frantic drumming to a measured pulse. Rain's assault eased into a persistent patter. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly pre-dawn light, filtering through storm-swept clouds. Inside, I remained cocooned in 2 small flames and a steadfast heartbeat. I rose carefully, extinguished my headlamp, and stood beside the lantern. Its golden glow bathed the room in a warm hush. I exhaled deeply, feeling the station's bones settle around me. In darkness, I had clung to pulse. In light, I fortified hope. Now, cocooned between shadow and dawn, I felt ready for whatever came next. The station shuddered under the storm's full fury, as if every gust sought to claw its way inside. I stood in the alcove, just beyond my shelter, lantern held high, and peered into the heart of the tempest. Rain lashed against the broken window panes, swirling in mad eddies that caught the lantern's glow and turned droplets into molten sparks. Each thunderclap was a jagged roar that rattled my teeth, and lightning arced across the sky with such blinding intensity that the station's battered walls gleamed like slick, wet obsidian. I anchored my feet against the warped floorboards and let the wind buffet me, testing my resolve. The howl pressed against my chest, an oppressive force that left my lungs trembling, and I had to fight the urge to stagger back into the safety of my bivvy nest. But this moment demanded confrontation. The storm had arrived not as a distant threat, but as a living onslaught, and I needed to stand in its path to protect my fragile refuge. I scanned the window's frame, where tarpaulin flapped under the gale's assault. My makeshift seals strained visibly, the rope braces quivering under pressure. I shifted to brace the window from the inside, pressing both palms against the soaked canvas. My shoulders burned as the wind shoved against me, but I leaned harder until the canvas bulged outward like a balloon at maximum expansion. In that taut membrane, I found a precarious equilibrium, the storm's teeth held at bay by the barrier of my arms. A bolt of lightning seared the darkness, revealing beads of condensation forming on the interior side. I met my own gaze in the lantern's blackened globe and felt a fierce swell of determination. I released my hold and stepped back, heart hammering. Rainwater pooled in rivulets along the floor, funneled by the lip of my oilskin dam. I traced the channel with my boot, watching droplets flow toward the waiting tray. Small victories, but crucial ones. If the water overtopped my dam, the entire bivvy nest would flood, and I'd lose my dry sanctuary. I held my breath and listened. The rain's drumming softened slightly, a sign that my channel was succeeding. Encouraged, I let a breath out with a whoosh that stirred the lantern's flame. Thunder cracked like a shattered mirror, and the floorboards underfoot trembled. I rushed to the center of the room, ducking beneath a loose beam that had begun to creak ominously. I set down the lantern and unshouldered my pack. From its depths, I produced a compact brush and dustpan tools I'd carried for cleaning gear, but repurposed tonight for shelter maintenance. I swept the floor free of splintered wood and sand, clearing any obstacles that could clog my dam or tangle my boots in an emergency scramble. Each movement was methodical, driven by the storm's drumbeat and my need for order amid chaos. A particularly violent gust slammed into the station, sending the roof's entire skeleton into a low-frequency groan that vibrated through my bones. Dust rained from the rafters, and I waved my hands to clear my eyes. When the air cleared, I saw that the tray I'd placed under the worst leak had filled nearly halfway. I scooped the water into a metal cup I'd salvaged from my kit, poured it out through the doorway, and set the cup aside to dry. Then I returned the tray, angling it to catch the next cascade. Lightning flared, illuminating a fracture in a ceiling beam I'd feared had split. My heart lurched as I moved to investigate. The beam's surface had jagged edges now, and moisture seeped from the fissure. Without hesitation, I rummaged through my pack for the clamp tool and wood strips. Kneeling on the damp floor, I wedged a strip beneath the crack, using the tool to tighten the clamp until the beam's edges met. The storm shrieked above in approval, and the groan that followed was less violent. The repair held. I climbed onto a rusted barrel to inspect the perimeter of the ceiling more closely. Each beam and panel had caught my attention earlier, but now, under this full-blown assault, I saw new weaknesses: a rivet torn from its mooring, another shingle peeling away like a rag. I anchored a coil of rope in one hand and lassoed it around the rivet's adjacent bracket, then tied off the rope's other end to a nearby column. The rope hummed under tension, and I patted it as if soothing a startled animal. This extra brace would keep the roof from flapping free in the wind's maw. My muscles trembled from the continuous work, and sweat mingled with rainwater on my brow. I slid down from the barrel and pressed my palm against the station's cold wall. The structure had borne decades of neglect and hours of storm, yet here it still stood cracked but unbowed. My breath echoed in the hollow corridors beyond the shelter, and I realized the storm's roar had dampened inside this room. The patches, braces, and dams were taking the brunt, giving me a pocket of tenuous safety amid the wild. But pockets could be breached. I needed to prepare for worst-case scenarios. I fetched the remaining length of tarpaulin and unfolded it with care. It was enough to cover half the ceiling if I could secure it. I looped one edge around a beam, drove a wooden wedge to lock it in place, then stretched the sheet across the expanse. Water pooled atop the tarpaulin like oil on water, and I slashed through the center with my knife blade to create a funnel. Then I rigged a cord beneath it, leading to the tray, turning this new canopy into a diversionary chute. Rainwater collecting overhead would now cascade along the tarp and into the waiting receptacle rather than seep into the shelter below. The station's roof groaned in response, as if lamenting a minor defeat, and the rain's drumming softened once more in this immediate space. I exhaled, feeling a wave of relief crash through me. My throat was parched, my limbs fatigued, but I'd carved a haven within the storm's wrath. Thunder rolled again, long, low, insistent, and I sensed the tempest's peak was near. I returned to my bivvy nest, sliding beneath the roll of canvas and oilskin. The material rustled as I snugged it around me, creating a cocoon that felt remarkably secure. I placed the lantern to my right and the candle to my left, so two flames would flank my head. Between them, I arranged my journal and pencil on a metal tray, ready to record the storm's final crescendo or its passing calm. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling that relentless heartbeat rub against my palm. Every system in my body sang with life, the roar in my ears, the pulse in my veins, the burn in my muscles. I closed my eyes and let the station's forge of wind and water hammer a slow lullaby. In that rhythm, I discerned the storm's arc, its violent opening gambit, its relentless middle, and if I could hold on, the gentle denouement that would follow. Lightning slashed the horizon one last time, and thunder answered like a distant choir. But inside this battered sanctuary, I lay cocooned in canvas and candlelight, cradled by every knot I had tied. The station and I, two battered souls, would face the storm's wrath together. And when dawn came, we would not only have survived, but proven our resilience against the night's fiercest trial. I retreated from the window's fury and sank to the floor beneath the battered table that served as my final line of defense. Its thin, warped planks offered scant protection, but by huddling beneath it, I reduced the number of surfaces the wind could strike directly. The moment I settled, I felt the room's chaos recede enough to draw a steadying breath, but the storm's muffled roar still vibrated through every beam and board. I curled into a tight fetal position, arms wrapped around my knees, as if cocooning myself in the table's fragile shelter would keep the gale at bay. Above me, tin sheets rattled like skeletal bones, and every clap of thunder shook the floor. Tiny droplets of rain leaked through the ceiling's cracks, plinking onto my shoulders and hands. I turned my face toward the trench of darkness under the table, searching for a pocket of absolute stillness. None existed, of course. Even silence here carried the tremor of fractured wood and howling wind. Yet in that confined space, the storm could only strike from above, and beyond the table's narrow shadow, a limitation I could exploit. My lantern and candle, perched on the floor just outside my cramped refuge, cast a warm glow that filtered beneath the table's edges. Flickers of light danced across the underside of the planks, turning raindrops caught in splinters into glittering motes. The effect was oddly hypnotic, an amber confetti storm falling upward against the dark. I pressed my cheek to the table's underside, its surface rough and pitted with old nail holes. The wood felt alive beneath my skin, pulsing faintly with each thunderclap. I drew my knees closer and rested my forehead against them, closing my eyes to the tempest's glare. Every exhale fogged the small triangle of space before me, and I focused on expelling tension with each breath. Inhale, count 2, exhale, count 2, holding on 2 counts between each. The rhythm echoed the drum of rain overhead, and I wove them together into a mantra that grounded me. Inhale the storm's ferocity. Exhale into stillness beneath the table. My hands roamed over the tarp under me, seeking familiar objects. First the edges of my journal, then the ridged cap of my thermos. I lifted the journal and flicked it open, pencil in hand, ready to record. But all I found on the page meant for this moment was a single sentence: shelter's fragile refuge. It felt inadequate now, too abstract, for the raw struggle unfolding above. Instead, I scribbled, "Under the battered table, wind howls, but cannot reach me as fully. Each breath is hard won." I closed the journal and slid it into my pocket, comforted by the act of writing. Words reminded me that I was observer and actor in this story, not merely prey to the storm. I pressed my hand again against the table's underside, then trailed my fingers along one of the support legs. It wobbled slightly under a particularly violent gust, and I pressed into it to steady the leg against the floor. The table quivered, but did not collapse. I glanced at the candle's glow, a dot of gold against the black. Its light had dimmed under the constant drafts, but still burned. Gathering courage, I nudged the table's edge with my boot, shifting it a few inches toward the corner. That move gave me room to stretch out my legs slightly and to wedge my body more securely between the leg and the floor. I exhaled, feeling my heart rate slow as I settled into a more stable position. The storm struck again with an almost malicious intensity that rattled the rafters overhead. A shard of tin tore free with a metallic scream and clattered onto the floor outside my refuge. I winced, chest tightening, then reminded myself of the table's purpose: to break the storm's force into something manageable. I placed both hands on the nearest plank above me and braced myself. When the gust subsided, I released my grip, letting limbs shake free of tension. In that give and take, I found resolve. Above the table's planks, small sprays of condensation traced icy lines that caught candlelight like miniature waterfalls. I let their soft glow lull me for a moment, reminding me that even in chaos, beauty could appear. Then I forced my gaze outward toward the lantern's halo, flickering at the table's edge. I needed to know what awaited when the storm's next wave crashed against my barrier. I unfolded myself as much as the cramped space allowed and inched a foot out, placing it gently on the tarp. The table's shadow was partial, leaving a thin sliver of exposed floor. I peered through that slit lantern, balanced on the table leg, and saw a thin sheet of water sweeping across the floor, drawn by my dam's slope toward the tray. The system held water directed away from my bivy nest. I exhaled a sigh, more audible than I intended. I pivoted slightly to reach for my multi-tool beside me and flicked the blade open. Its small, serrated edge was perfect for widening any holes that had begun to form in the table's cracks, so I could insert wooden wedges for added reinforcement. I worked by lantern light, wedging saplings of scrap wood I'd salvaged earlier into splits in the planks. Each wedge caused a series of creaks and groans as the table flexed and I tensed with every protest until the planks stilled under their new supports. The action reinforced my confidence. The table was no longer a simple piece of furniture. It had become a bastion, a second skin of shelter. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heartbeat match the rhythm of rain drumming above. Fear lingered, but it had been transmuted brew of adrenaline and respect for the storm's power. I'd adapted, and shaped my environment to withstand the chaos. A lull followed a brief pause as the storm gathered strength for its next assault. I felt the station's bones hold their breath. The table's legs creaked. The tarp's folds quivered. In that suspended moment, I considered my own body's limits, fatigue tugging at my muscles' raw edges of bruised ribs protesting every breath. Yet I sensed that my core would carry me through. The flame overhead reminded me of warmth within reach. I reached into my pocket, withdrawing a small bar of dark chocolate I'd stashed for emergencies. I unwrapped it and pressed it between my teeth, letting it melt slowly. The sweetness swelled in my mouth, seeping warmth into my chest, more potent than any sip of tea. Bitterness balanced the sugar, a reminder that life here was a blend of hardship and small mercies. As I savored the chocolate, I listened to the storm's shifting cadence. The drums grew more rhythmic again, steady now, as if it sought to lull rather than break me. I closed my eyes and let its song wash over me, melding with my breath and the table's shelter. I felt the night's vastness press beyond, but beneath this battered plank I was anchored. I opened my eyes and slid my hand into the pocket, holding my photo of Jenna and me on Mont Silver Peak. Its edges were damp, but the image still clear. I pressed it to my heart, then placed it atop the journal's repaired cover, perched beside the table leg. In that act, I wove memory into refuge, a tether to calmer summits and shared triumphs. Another gust roared fierce and sudden while rattling the station's bones. I gripped the wooden wedge I'd installed and braced the table's underside, leaning all my weight into the plank above. The board groaned but did not break. The beam above moaned in solidarity. When the assault ended, I released my hold, heart racing. I exhaled, chest heaving, then allowed a slow smile to spread across my face. I was still here. My fragile refuge had held. I lay back against the table's inside shoulders, resting on the support leg. The rain's drumming softened for a moment, and I heard a distant bird call, perhaps a cockatoo seeking shelter. Its stray note felt surreal against the storm's backdrop, but reminded me that life persisted outside. Inside my own life beat strong pulse matching the candle's flicker. I closed my eyes and let the candle's warmth kiss my face. Each breath became deliberate. Inhale warmth, exhale fear. The table above me braced and wedged, felt less like a burden and more like an ally. It bore the storm's brunt so I could survive. In that shared endurance, we were intertwined. My mind drifted briefly to Dawn's promise, how soft light would filter through broken panes and illuminate my refuge in golden hues. But that was a distant chapter. For now, I was here beneath a battered table, each breath a victory, each heartbeat a pledge to endure. Lightning forked across the sky with a blinding glare, splitting the station's interior into stark contrasts of light and shadow. In that momentary flash, every worn beam, every patch of tarpaulin, and every droplet of rain became crystalline and clear. The sudden brightness revealed the full extent of the storm's assault, a gaping hole in the ceiling, patched too hastily, a shattered window barely covered by canvas, and the battered table under which I sheltered groaning in protest. But more importantly, the lightning illuminated my own reflection in the lantern's glass globe, a wide-eyed figure streaked with grime but resolute. In that burst of clarity, panic dissolved. I saw not a victim of the storm, but its equal, and perhaps its victor. I took a deep, deliberate breath, letting the electricity in the air fill my lungs and charge my veins. The thunder that followed was deafening, as if the sky itself applauded my resolve. I stood planting my boots firmly on the tarp and allowed the adrenaline to sharpen my senses. Every creak of wood, every drip of water, every gasp of wind became information rather than threat. I was awake, alive, and determined to see this trial through. The immediate task was clear: reinforce the station's weaknesses before the next thunderclap. I moved first to the ceiling, where that jagged gap yawned overhead. It was the largest breach, and each flash of lightning had shown me how much rain still poured in. I retrieved the extra oilskin tarp I'd reserved for emergencies, unrolled it with careful precision, and hoisted it above my head. Lantern light caught the slick surface, transforming it into a shimmering shield. I swung my arms in wide arcs, pressing the oilskin against the ceiling's jagged edges, and tied its corners to the nearby rafters with sturdy rope. Each knot I made was an affirmation I would not be overwhelmed. Beneath the new canopy, I anchored lengths of cord in a crosshatch pattern, creating a cradle that held the tarp flush against the ceiling. Sparks of rain dotted the oilskin, but none penetrated into the shelter below. I patted the tarp, feeling its taut, reassuring strength. The station creaked under the storm's weight, but I had carved out a dry pocket-proof that fear could be subdued by action. Turning, I surveyed the room's perimeter. Water trickled in trickles and streams, guided by my improvised channels, but one corner still collected puddles that threatened the bivy nest. I moved to the far side of the room and found a discarded metal bucket, rusted but sound, and set it beneath the worst leak. The echo of falling droplets into metal was a steady heartbeat, a new rhythm to guide me. Each splash was evidence of progress, water-contained refuge secured. My gaze drifted to the table refuge. If I remained under there, I would be safe only so long as the roof remained intact. But with the ceiling patched, I was free to stand tall again. I released the wedge and rope, bracing one of the sagging beams, pried it loose, and jammed it against a solid post at a steep angle. Acting like a prop under the weight of a great door, the beam now bore the roof's pressure, relieving strain from its weakened center. Dust cascaded down as the beam settled into place, and I felt a surge of triumph. Emboldened, I retrieved the multi-tool and trimmed splintered wood from the beam's fracture, then applied a coat of waterproof adhesive from a small tube in my survival kit. The glue sealed the hairline cracks and bonded the tarp's edge to the rough wood. Lightning flashed again, and I watched drops bead and roll away, proof that my repair was sound. I allowed myself a grin sharp and unexpected in the candlelight. Next, I reassessed my own position. My boots were damp, my jacket streaked with grit, and exhaustion tugged at my limbs. But the flash of lightning had reminded me that resolve was stronger than fatigue. I shed my soaked gloves and stretched my stiff fingers, then rolled up my sleeves and knelt to organize my gear. I separated essential items, first aid kit, headlamp journal, the thermos, and packed them into a waterproof bag, ensuring they remained dry if the storm worsened. The act of sorting, folding, sealing gave me calm focus. I paused to sip tea from my thermos, savoring the bitterness and warmth. The flavor cut through the metallic tang of rainwater and soot, grounding me in the moment. I held the cup beneath the lantern's glow, studying the swirling steam. In its dance, I saw both the storm's fury and the promise of dawn's gentler warmth. I breathed in that duality and exhaled doubt. Then I turned my attention to the room's entrance. The door was the weakest link. Once the wind broke through it, the station would become a wind tunnel. I tied a length of rope across the door's interior, fashioned into a handle that allowed me to close and open it quickly. I draped a spare piece of tarp over the top half, kind of storm curtain, weighted by sand collected in my boot. Now, any blast of wind would first have to lift the curtain and pull against the rope before gaining full access. I tested it by moving the curtain, and it resisted fiercely, folding back into place as soon as I released it. Night deepened, and the storm's energy subtly shifted from relentless battering to a more rumbling persistence. The initial violence was spent, but the gale had not abated. I relit the candle beneath the table, ensuring that at least one flame remained separate from the lantern's cluster. In the event of another blackout, I'd have the secondary light source. Attention to redundancy had saved me before, and I honored that lesson. My thoughts drifted afterward to the emotional core of survival. Every repair, every knot, every patch was more than practical necessity. It was a statement of my intent to endure. Each flashed bolt of lightning had revealed not just my surroundings, but also the depth of my own resolve. I knelt before the patched ceiling and placed a hand on the bowed beam I'd propped. "We stand together," I murmured. "No storm will defeat us." The beam vibrated under the station's roar, as if acknowledging the pact. Finally, I settled back onto the bivvy nest, pulling the oilskin high around my shoulders. The station felt different now, empowered by my interventions, more robust than any abandoned structure had the right to be. The storm's roar was still monumental, but it no longer felt like an opposing force. It was part of the crucible that had forged this fragile refuge. I closed my eyes and let my body sink into the bivvy's warmth. My breathing matched the slower, deeper rhythm of the storm's new phase. Inhale determination, exhale fear, inhale strength, exhale doubt. Each cycle reinforced the bond between my actions and my survival. As I drifted toward rest, the station creaked one last time, a long, low note as if sighing in relief. The wind's howl softened at the windows. Rain's drumming became a lullaby, and in that shared exhalation, the station and I had transcended mere endurance. We had become survivors, illuminated by lightning and bound by resolve. In the sudden hush following that last bolting of lightning, it felt as though the storm paused to gather its breath, and so did I. I stepped out from beneath the battered table, leaving behind its sheltered envelope, and stood in the center of the room under the lantern's steady glow. The air was thick with the scent of wet timber and ozone charged with energy, that pulsed softly now rather than slammed. I closed my eyes and tilted my face upward as if seeking communion with the storm's still beating heart. In that moment, I sensed its eye, a calm circle at the heart of chaos, where wind stilled and rain lifted briefly before the final onslaught. I opened my eyes to see the ceiling's patched tarp sag slightly under pooled water, and I hurried to scoop it free with cupped hands. Water sluiced down the rope channel I'd rigged, dripping into the metal bucket with a muted plink. The station's bones settled around me in respectful acknowledgement of our truce. I exhaled, letting tension slip from my shoulders in a long, slow exhalation as the lantern's gentle radiance bathed the room in forgiving light. Here in this fleeting calm, I felt both triumphant and vulnerable. Months of planning, decades of training, all had led me to this precise instant where action and patience converged. I knelt before the station's main support beam, eyes tracing the braided rope that held rafters aloft and the oilskin canopy stretched overhead. This was the eye of the night's tempest, a sanctuary carved by sweat and grit, a fragile bubble in a world gone mad with wind. I pressed my palm to the beam, feeling its steady thrum, and murmured a quiet gratitude. The station had endured centuries of neglect. I had supported it through hours of wrath. In this union of human resolve and built shelter, we had found momentary peace. But peace in a storm was always fleeting. My instincts told me the storm's eye would pass and violence would return, perhaps gentler, perhaps more capricious. I rose and moved to the door's storm curtain, gently lifting the tarp slit to peer outside. Rain had slackened to a steady drizzle, and wind chased droplets across the platform in lazy arcs. Mist clung to the rails beyond, turning the rusted tracks into ghostly ribbons fading into gray. Beyond the station's boundaries, the desert lay smoothed under a film of moisture, its dunes softened by the storm's passing. A lone dead tree on the horizon creaked its branches, reaching skyward as if worshiping the last gasp of the tempest. I allowed myself a small smile at the sight. Out there, life would soon begin its slow reclamation of the shaken land. In here, I would rest briefly before the station's crucible resumed. I closed the curtain and returned to the room's center, mindful of every drop that still trickled through. The lantern and candle both burned with equal fervor, their flicker now steady and confident. I knelt beside my bivy nest and examined its dryness. The oilskin remained taut overhead, channeling water away as intended. The floor beneath was slightly damp, but no more than a morning dew. Each barrier I'd constructed had held. I pressed a fingertip to a spot that once wept rain and found it dry. Relief pooled in my chest, mellower than adrenaline, yet equally potent. I retrieved my journal and penciled a brief entry, eye of the storm, a breath in chaos. Shelter held. I closed it with a soft snap, savoring the finality of the words. The act of writing had always anchored me, transforming transient feelings into enduring record. Rest beckoned, but I resisted for a moment longer. I had promised myself that in this calm I would survey the station one last time before the tempest's final wave. I rose and donned my headlamp, its beam narrow but bright compared to the lantern's glow. I took one slow lap around the perimeter, checking every rope knot, every clamp, every canvas patch. Each held firm. I paused at the window's board, pressing a hand against the canvas seal and feeling only the gentle pulse of trapped air. A satisfied breath escaped me. By the time I returned to the lantern's embrace, my boots carried dust blended with water and oil, evidence of every mile traveled in the station's interior. My jacket, once damp at the shoulders, now felt dry except for the collar. I unzipped it and shook out any lingering moisture, then rebuttoned and smoothed the fabric. Small details, they mattered here, as much as big interventions. Finally, I slid into the bivvy, letting its oil-skinned inner lining fold around me like a second skin. The station's floor felt firm beneath, and I curled into a semi-fetal position, resting my head on my folded arms. The lantern and candle remained at either side sentries in amber, while the headlamp lay clipped to the table edge. I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to savor the calm heart of night's storm. In the hush, I tuned in to my own heartbeat, steady, even no longer racing. Each thump was a testament to resistance, a proclamation that life endured even when swallowed by darkness. The storm's roar had receded to a distant murmur, more akin to a lullaby than a threat. I felt a current of gratitude for every tool, every act, every breath that had led me here. Yet sleep was still a luxury I had to earn. I focused on breath, inhaling hope, and exhaling doubt, cycling the mantra I'd honed: inhale, strength, exhale, fear, inhale, calm, exhale, tension. The world outside remained restless, but in here I held a fragile dominion of peace. Lightning flickered distant once more, but its presence felt distant, like an echo in a cave. The station's bones stood firm, and I too stood firm, no longer combating panic, but embracing resilience. I permitted a gentle smile to cross my lips at the thought that I had become part of this place's tapestry, a living thread woven into weathered timber and battered tarpaulin. A final breath slipped through my lips as the storm's eye drifted away. In that exhalation, I felt both the station's tired bones and my own sinews soften. Tomorrow I would step into the fading storm's aftermath. Tonight, in the eye of the tempest, I lay cradled by calm and by the promise of dawn. A pale gray tinge seeped into the sky as the storm's final growls retreated beyond the station's walls. The ambient roar became a soft, distant whisper, and the wind's force that had battered me all night now eased to a sibilant sigh. I emerged from beneath the battered table, each movement deliberate and unhurried after hours of high alert. My joints ached from every brace, every knot, every tense moment, but relief buoyed my spirits and lightened my steps. Lantern and candle burned with a gentle steadiness, their flames dancing slower, now less hungry for oxygen. I stepped into the center of the room and paused, breathing in the cool, humid air that smelled of wet earth and softened metal. The station felt new in this gentle afterglow, its scars visible, yet softened by the dawn's tender light peeking through patched windows. First order of business tending the bivvy nest. I knelt beside my oilskin cocoon and peeled back its edge, inspecting for any residual moisture or debris. A few droplets had seeped along a seam, but they'd pooled harmlessly in the tray below. I shook out the bivvy's interior, smoothing its surface and fluffing the insulated liner. Sliding inside, I folded the edges snugly around my shoulders, creating a sheltered cocoon that felt more like a cradle than a makeshift bed. Next, I methodically retraced my steps through the room, extinguishing extra light sources to conserve fuel for the final watch. I doused the candle beneath the table, leaving only the lantern's steady glow. Its soft illumination cast long, calm shadows, transforming the station's battered interior into a sanctuary rather than a crucible. I filled a small cup from my thermos and sipped the remaining tea, its warmth gently permeating my chest. I considered brewing more water using my camp stove, but decided against it. The station's sanctity was more precious than a hot drink in this final hour. I rose and donned my headlamp, once more running its beam along the perimeter. The repaired ceiling overhead held firm, and each rope brace was taut and unyielding. Wood and metal that glowed softly beneath the lamp's beam, revealing every knot and splice. I felt a wave of quiet pride. Each repair had been an act of faith in my own hands and in this shelter. The station and I had persevered in tandem, and now its bones stood straight once more. Turning, I walked to the doorway where the storm curtain hung. Carefully, I lifted the tarp to peek out. The platform lay slick with rain, reflecting the morning's muted light like a mirror. Beyond the desert stretched dunes sculpted by wind into gentle curves. A few hardy shrubs drooped under the storm's weight leaves, dripping with moisture. The world looked washed clean, inviting exploration and respite. I lowered the curtain and returned inside, mindful of every sound, a distant bird call, the drip of residual water, the soft creak of settling beams. Silence reigned, but it was the calm after orchestral chaos, a stillness full of promise rather than threat. I made my way to the window I'd braced against the storm's first bite. Removing the interior tarp and rope braces, carefully, I freed the patched board and set it aside. I peeled back the canvas and wiped the window's edge with a cloth clearing wet grit. I straightened the frame and tucked the canvas into my pack, deciding to preserve it as a keepsake of this trial. Light streamed in unobstructed, now casting a gentle glow across the lantern's glow and revealing dust motes dancing in shafts of dawn. My path led me next to the storage room door, the site of my earliest preparations. I unlaced the rope crossbar and folded the cord, neatly placing it in my kit. I lifted the door's edge and inspected the seals I'd pressed into cracks. All remained intact, defying the storm's fury. I brushed my palm over the weathered timber, feeling its solidity beneath calloused fingers. I murmured a silent thanks for shelter, for challenge, and for the bond formed in adversity. Returning to the station's main concourse, I paused where the roof had collapsed. Under this soft morning light, shattered sheets of tin lay in twisted heaps, and beams that once groaned under wind now rested in patient repose. I traced a finger along a jagged edge, remembering adrenaline-fueled hours of repair. Here, the storm had carved its fiercest mark, but even here, time and gravity had reclaimed their right to quiet. I gathered a small splinter of tin as a memento of the station's endurance and tucked it into my jacket pocket. My next task was to secure my gear for departure. I retrieved the waterproof bag and methodically packed essential supplies, journal, multi-tool headlamp, and thermos. I slung my pack over my shoulders and felt its reassuring weight, a measure of all that had carried me through. In its compartments lay both memories and tools, photo of Jenna and me, extra wicks, spare cord, small first aid items, and now a carefully rolled piece of the patched canvas. Each pocket held a story, each zipper a testament to preparation's importance. As I stood in the station's cleared center, the lantern flickered once, then steadied its wick, drinking deeply from the reservoir I'd tended throughout the night. I knelt to refill it with the extra kerosene bottles I'd rescued from the lamp room, ensuring it would burn long enough to guide anyone who followed or to light my way back if I chose to linger. The act felt ceremonious, like passing on a torch from one guardian to the next. Just beyond the doorway, the first rays of sun painted the horizon in strokes of rose and gold. I stepped outside, setting the lantern on the threshold. Its glow commingled with dawn's light, a bridge between night's trials and day's promise. A gentle breeze drifted across the platform, carrying the scent of damp earth and cool air. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the morning fill my lungs. I turned back to the station's entrance, taking in the battered facade, softened by dawn. Corrugated walls bore scars of wind and rain, yet they stood upright, silent custodians of the night's saga. I placed a hand against the cool iron, feeling its slight tremor from lingering drafts. Then I retrieved the small broken clock from the waiting lounge, its hands frozen at 6:47, and tucked it into my pack. A memento, perhaps, of time's suspension in this crucible. A final glance inside revealed the station as I'd left it. Patched ceilings, braced beams, my bivvy nest folded neatly in the corner. The place had transformed from an abandoned relic into a living workshop of survival. I felt reverence for its resilience and for the endurance I'd mustered. I hoisted my pack, slung the lantern over my shoulder, and stepped fully onto the platform. The station's door swung gently on its repaired hinges, creaking a soft farewell. Behind me, the interior lay in peaceful repose, every anchor and brace holding fast. Ahead, the desert beckoned, dunes glowing under the newborn sun. I took a steady step forward, boots crunching on rain-slicked sand, and felt the station's presence at my back, solid, silent, steadfast. My heart thrummed with lasting warmth, no longer fueled by fear, but by accomplishment. I breathed in the quiet vastness of the Outback and exhaled gratitude. With the station's battered bones silhouetted against soft light, I walked westward along the rails, following the path that led me here. My footsteps were sure, each imprint a promise that wherever trials raged, I would meet them with preparation, courage, and resilience. The station stood behind me, sentinel of my victory, as I ventured into dawn's gentle embrace. Dawn's first light filtered through the broken panes, softening jagged edges with a pale golden haze. I stood on the platform, shoulders still leaning against the cool corrugated iron, watching how gentle rays crept across wet sand and glinted off pooled water in the station's interior. The world felt hushed sound reduced to the whispers of a breeze, settling at last birds, tentatively calling from distant scrub. In that moment, the station and I shared a collective exhale. The storm's final roars receded behind us, and morning's calm took its place. I lifted the lantern from the threshold and carried it inside its glow, blending with the dawn. Inside, every surface bore marks of the tempest-patched tarps sagging under early dew ropes, knotted in resolute arcs, spilled drops still beating on oilskin. Yet the atmosphere was transformed by daylight. Shadows that once threatened now lay soft and forgiving. I set the lantern near the entrance, its flame a small pulse of warmth amid the pale illumination. Stepping into the main concourse, I paused to absorb the station's battered grandeur. Beams I'd braced stretched overhead like proud ribs. My oilskin canopy glowed faintly where morning light peeked through seams. I ran a hand along a rope brace, feeling its taut fibers under calloused fingers. Each knot told a story of resistance. The first gale's bite, the thunderous onslaught, the pitched battle of wind and wood. Now, under calm skies, those knots felt like medals of perseverance. I made my way to the waiting lounge, where the clock remained frozen at 6:47. I retrieved it, gently marveling at how time had both stood still and raced through the night's trial. Its cracked glass was a fracture in stillness, a reminder that beauty can emerge from imperfection. I cradled the clock in my hands, then returned it to a shelf beside the ledger I'd found in the lamp room, both artifacts of the station's history and my own journey. The station's floorboards, once swollen with moisture, now dried in the sun's warmth, creaked softly beneath each step. I paused at the storage room door, remembering how fear had first taken root and how carefully I'd built my refuge. I opened the door and peered inside. My bivy nest lay folded neatly, in its corner lantern and journal perched like guardians. I stepped in, inhaled the faint scent of tea and oil, and smiled at the memory of every moment spent here, moments of doubt and triumph, interwoven like threads in a tapestry. The fresh air carried the scent of damp wood and desert flowers blooming after the rain. I stepped back into the corridor, where shards of broken glass now glimmered like jewels in the dawn. I bent to gather a few fragments, clear, jagged prisms of past violence turned into small treasures of light. Tucking them into my pack, I felt gratitude for every piece of this place, every splintered board, every droplet of water, every gust of wind that had tested me. At the edge of the platform, I took a final look westward. The rails stretched toward the horizon, their rusted surface warmed by morning's glow. A solitary kangaroo paused to regard me from beyond the station gates, its silhouette outlined in gold. It watched for a moment, then bounded away into the soft dunes. That brief encounter, nature's quiet acknowledgement, felt like a benediction. I turned back, shouldered my pack, and stepped across the threshold into the station's heart. I ran a hand along the oilskin canopy overhead, where tears of rain had once threatened to pour in. Now those lines of wear were gentle creases, tokens of the storm I had weathered. I traced the path I'd walked all night, from the lamp room's shadows to the storage room's refuge, from the rotting roof's skeleton to the battered table's sanctuary. Each step had been a chapter, and I'd written them with energy and resolve. My boots carried the imprint of every board, every crate, every makeshift dam I'd built. I paused at the door marked lamp room and tapped lightly on the frame, no longer a locked treasure trove, but a pillar of support in a place reborn. I imagined future travelers finding this station. They'd see signs of my passing, knotted ropes, patched tarps, jars of extra oil left on shelves. I hoped they'd understand the silent invitation here lies refuge for those who come after. As the sun climbed higher, warmth filled the station's interior. The lantern's flame flickered and steadied in the gentle air, mirroring the steadiness of my own pulse. I took a deep breath, letting calm spread through every muscle. This was more than survival. It was communion with a place that had challenged and sustained me in equal measure. Stepping finally into the morning's embrace, I closed the station doors behind me with deliberate care. The repaired hinges creaked softly as if in farewell. Outside, the desert awaited boundless and inviting. I hoisted the lantern overhead, its light now a companion to the dawn, and set off along the rails toward the rising sun. Every step felt both ending and beginning. The storm's fury was behind me, etched in memory and in every repair. Ahead lay gentle day, soft horizons, and the promise that no trial could extinguish the resolve of a human heart. As I walked, the station stood silent sentinel, its battered bones and triumphant spirit woven into the Outback's vast tapestry forever, a testament to resilience and the quiet power of endurance. The tense dance of wind and timber has given way to the soft hush of dawn. Gentle rays now filter through broken panes, painting every scar with a golden glow. Feel the lingering warmth of those first light beams seep into your bones, chasing away the memory of howling gales. In this moment, every creak and sigh of the station has softened into a quiet breath, a gentle lullaby after the storm's roar. Rest your mind on the promise of safety found in small victories, a rope's steadfast knot, a patched canopy keeping out rain, a battered table offering shelter. Each was a lifeline woven from attention and grit. Let the memory of these acts comfort you, reminding you that presence and purposeful action can carve out refuge anywhere, even amid chaos. As the station stands in gentle repose, its battered beams aligned with soft light, allow your own heartbeat to slow. Breathe in calm, 2 counts and hold the peace. 1 count, exhale, tension, 2 counts, hold 1 count. Feel your pulse settle into the land's natural rhythm, a quiet partnership with steadied walls and warming air. Imagine the scent of damp earth mingling with oilskin and tea grounding you in the present. Let gratitude wash over you for the shelter carved from the storm's wrath and for the lessons forged in every challenge. In this soft aftermath, weariness becomes a gentle friend urging rest rather than fear. Now, as the station's doors close, softly on night's trials, close your own eyes. Envision yourself stepping into the Outback's warm light, every step an affirmation that resilience blooms in caring hands. Drift into calm dreaming, cradled by the hush of dawn and the steadfast heartbeat that carried you through the storm.